mocked for marrying a poor man. The Omega watched as the groom revealed himself as the Lycan King. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Elena Whitmore. Elena stood at the edge of the clearing where the ceremony was being held, the late afternoon sun slanting through the tall pines and settling like pale gold on the gathered pack, and she could feel every eye on her, weighing her choice, measuring her worth, and quietly deciding she had made the greatest mistake of her life. As an Omega, she had grown used to lowered voices and polite smiles that never reached the eyes. But today there was no effort to hide the judgment, no attempt at courtesy, because she had dared to marry a man everyone believed was beneath them all. Adrian Blackwood stood beside her, calm and still, dressed simply, his suit clean but clearly worn, the kind of clothing that spoke of careful mending rather than abundance, and the contrast between them and the rest of the gathering felt sharp enough to cut. Whispers drifted through the air like falling leaves, comments about wasted potential and foolish loyalty, about how an Omega should have waited for something better, about how love, if this was love at all, would not fill an empty pantry or command respect. Elena kept her chin lifted and her hands steady, even as heat crept into her cheeks, because she knew what it meant to be underestimated, and she refused to let their laughter take anything more from her. She remembered the quiet certainty she had felt when Adrian had asked her to marry him, not with grand promises or displays of power, but with honesty, with an offer of partnership that treated her like an equal, and that memory anchored her now as the officiant cleared his throat and the crowd shifted impatiently. The vows were simple, spoken without flourish, yet Elena felt their weight settle into her bones, grounding her in a way she had never known. And when she slipped the ring onto Adrian's finger, she sensed a stillness ripple outward, subtle but unmistakable, as if the forest itself had paused to listen. A few feet away, someone scoffed openly, and another laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive, but Elena did not turn, did not flinch, because she had learned that dignity was sometimes the quiet decision to remain exactly where you were. Adrian met her gaze then, his eyes steady, unreadable, holding something deeper than reassurance. And in that look Elena felt a promise she could not yet name, a certainty that this moment, mocked and diminished by others, was only the beginning of something far larger than they imagined. The gathering did not end with applause or warmth, but with a restless murmur that followed Elena and Adrian as they walked away from the clearing and toward the narrow path leading back to the edge of the packlands. And with every step Elena could feel the weight of unfinished judgment pressing against her back like a cold wind. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground, and she focused on the steady rhythm of her breathing, on the quiet strength of the hand Adrian offered without a word, a silent question she answered by lacing her fingers with his. They did not speak at first, because there were moments when words felt too fragile, too easily twisted, and this was one of them. Elena replayed the looks she had seen during the ceremony, the thin smiles, the raised brows, the pity that stung more than open mockery, and she wondered how long it would take before the whispers followed them beyond the trees, into every corner of pack life, where she would now be known as the Omega who married poorly. Adrian's pace was unhurried, his posture relaxed in a way that seemed almost out of place after what they had endured, and that calm unsettled her more than the insults had, because it did not match the tension she felt coiled inside her chest. When they reached the small cabin that would be their home, simple and weathered but solid, Elena paused, taking in the rough wooden steps and the faint smell of pine carried on the breeze, and she reminded herself that she had chosen this path with clear eyes. Inside, the space was modest. A single room with a sturdy table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed tucked against the far wall, but it was clean, cared for, and unmistakably real, not the temporary arrangement so many had assumed this marriage would be. Elena set aside her wrap and turned to Adrian, finally meeting his gaze fully, searching for regret or doubt, and finding neither, only a depth that made her heart steady in a way she had never felt before. She spoke then, quietly but firmly, telling him she did not need apologies or explanations, that she understood the cost of standing with him, and that she would not shrink from it simply because others expected her to. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful, and when he answered, his voice was gentle, deliberate, carrying a certainty that wrapped around her words rather than opposing them. He told her that he had seen the strength in her long before today, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that endured, and that what they had faced at the ceremony was only the surface of a deeper test neither of them could yet fully see. Outside, night settled in, the sounds of the forest growing louder, and Elena felt a strange shift within herself, as if crossing the threshold into this quiet space had also marked a crossing inside her, from a life defined by expectation to one shaped by choice. She realized then that the mockery, though painful, had stripped away illusions she no longer needed, revealing a truth she could stand on, that respect given conditionally was never worth keeping. Adrian moved to light a small lamp, its warm glow filling the room, and for a moment they simply stood there, side by side, sharing the silence, aware that eyes still watched from a distance, and that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also aware that something irrevocable had been set in motion, something that could not be undone by laughter or doubt, and Elena felt, with surprising clarity, that whatever lay ahead, she would face it not as a solitary Omega, but as a woman who had chosen her path and would walk it without looking back. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through the trees in soft bands of light, and Elena awoke with a brief, disorienting moment where she forgot where she was, only to remember everything at once: the ceremony, the laughter, the cabin, and the steady presence of the man she had married. Adrian was already awake, standing near the small window, as if listening to something beyond the forest, and when he turned toward her, his expression was composed but intent, as though the day ahead required a level of attention he did not take lightly. Elena arose and smoothed her dress, aware that stepping outside together would mean stepping back into a world that had already judged them, and yet she felt no urge to hide, only a calm resolve that surprised her. When they walked into the village later that morning, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Conversation stalled mid-sentence, eyes followed their movements, and a silence settled that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Elena noticed how people looked first at Adrian's worn coat, then at her, then away, as if confirming their assumptions, and she held her posture steady, refusing to let her shoulders curve inward under the familiar pressure. They passed the market stall slowly, the smell of fresh bread and pine resin mixing in the air, and Elena caught fragments of whispers, not loud enough to confront, but sharp enough to sting, remarks about practicality, about survival, about how an Omega should know better. Adrian did not respond, did not correct anyone, and that restraint puzzled her, because there was something in his presence that suggested he could, if he wished, change the tone of the entire street with a single word. Instead, he focused on Elena, occasionally adjusting his pace to match hers, a small gesture that grounded her more than any defense ever could. Near the center of the square, they encountered a cluster of pack members who did not bother to disguise their curiosity, and one of them offered a thin smile, congratulating Elena with a tone that implied she had accepted her limits rather than chosen her future. Elena thanked them politely, her voice even, and as they moved on, she felt a flicker of something like pride, not in enduring the insult, but in recognizing that it no longer defined her. As the morning wore on, subtle shifts emerged: a shopkeeper who hesitated before turning them away, a pair of elders who paused to study Adrian more closely than before, and Elena sensed the beginning of uncertainty threading through the earlier certainty of dismissal. There was something about Adrian's quiet confidence, about the way he observed without reacting, that unsettled expectations, and she realized that the same calm that had disturbed her the night before was now creating ripples she could feel even if she could not yet see their end. By the time they returned to the cabin, Elena's emotions felt layered rather than raw, the hurt still present, but tempered by a growing awareness that the story others told about her marriage was not the one she was living. She turned to Adrian as they stepped inside, finally asking what he was listening for that morning, what had held his attention with such focus, and he answered with a measured honesty: telling her that change often announced itself quietly before it arrived loudly, and that patience, though rarely valued, was sometimes the most powerful choice a person could make. Elena considered his words as she set about preparing a simple meal, and she felt something settle into place within her, a sense that whatever lay ahead, she was standing at the beginning of a path that would test more than her endurance, a path that would ask her to trust not only in the man beside her, but in the strength she was only just beginning to recognize in herself. The following days settled into a quiet pattern that drew more attention than open defiance ever could, because Elena and Adrian did not retreat from pack life, nor did they seek approval, and that balance unsettled those who expected embarrassment to make them smaller. Each morning Elena walked into the village to trade goods or offer help where it was needed, and each time she felt the same eyes tracking her movements, measuring whether she would falter, whether marrying a man with no visible status had finally taught her her place. Instead, she spoke kindly, listened carefully, and carried herself with the same composed dignity she had shown on her wedding day, and that consistency slowly began to confuse the narrative others had written for her. Adrian accompanied her often, never hovering, never posturing, yet always present, and Elena noticed how people reacted to him in subtle ways, how conversations paused when he passed, how even the most dismissive alphas lowered their voices without quite knowing why. It was not fear, exactly, but an instinctive caution, the kind that rose unbidden and left questions behind. One afternoon, as Elena helped an elder organize supplies near the edge of the square, a disagreement broke out nearby over access to shared resources, voices rising with frustration rather than anger, and Elena felt the familiar pull to intervene, to ease tension rather than escalate it. She stepped forward calmly, offering a practical compromise that addressed both sides, and to her surprise, the argument softened, not because she was an Omega, but because she was reasonable, and that simple shift left several onlookers unsettled. Adrian watched quietly from a short distance, his expression thoughtful, and when one of the disputing alphas glanced at him, something like recognition flickered and then vanished, leaving unease in its wake. Later, as they walked home along the narrow trail, Elena asked Adrian if he had noticed the change, the way people hesitated now, as if rethinking assumptions they had made too quickly, and he nodded, explaining that power was not always announced, sometimes it was sensed, and that what unsettled others most was not what they could see, but what they could not easily define. That evening, a visitor arrived at the cabin, an emissary from a neighboring pack, polite but guarded, asking questions that seemed casual on the surface, yet carried a deeper intent. Inquiries about Adrian's background, his travels, his plans. Elena answered where she could, Adrian where he chose, and throughout the exchange, Elena felt the air shift, as though something long contained was pressing closer to the surface. When the visitor finally left, his courtesy intact but his certainty shaken, Elena realized that their marriage had become more than a private decision. It had become a point of curiosity, even concern, and that realization sent a quiet thrill of apprehension through her. She did not fear what might come, but she understood that remaining unnoticed was no longer an option, and that their continued calm was, in its own way, an act of defiance. As night fell, Elena stood outside the cabin, watching the stars emerge one by one, and she felt the weight of expectation pressing from all sides, not crushing, but shaping, and she knew that whatever Adrian had not yet told her was tied to this growing attention. Still, she chose not to demand answers, trusting the steadiness she had seen in him, trusting the path she had chosen, and in that quiet decision, she felt herself step fully into a role she had never been allowed to claim before, not as an Omega defined by others, but as a woman whose choices were beginning to alter the balance of the world around her. The tension that had been building around Elena and Adrian finally began to take a clearer shape, not through confrontation, but through a tension that felt deliberate rather than curious, and Elena sensed at the moment a formal notice was delivered to the cabin, sealed and precise, requesting their presence at a council gathering scheduled for the end of the week. Such invitations were rarely extended to those without standing, and the fact that it named Adrian alongside her sent a ripple of unease through her, because it confirmed what she had already felt, that they were no longer being observed casually. Adrian read the notice without visible reaction, but Elena noticed the subtle shift in his focus, the way his posture straightened as if aligning with something long familiar, and that quiet change spoke louder than any explanation. Over the next days, preparations for the gathering became a topic of open discussion throughout the pack, and Elena heard her name spoken with a mixture of speculation and restraint, as though people were unsure which version of her they were meant to address, the underestimated Omega or the woman whose choices were beginning to disrupt expectations. When she walked through the village now, greetings were more careful, questions more restrained, and she felt the strange pressure of being reevaluated in real time, a process both unsettling and empowering. Adrian, meanwhile, seemed to move through these shifts with an ease that bordered on inevitability, offering few words, yet commanding space without effort, and Elena found herself watching him more closely, not out of doubt, but out of curiosity that had grown too persistent to ignore. One evening, as they sat together outside the cabin, the air cool and clear, Elena finally spoke of it, not accusing, not demanding, but acknowledging that the world around them was changing in response to him as much as to her, and that she needed to understand what that meant for the life they were building. Adrian listened, his attention complete, and when he answered, he did not give her titles or explanations, only a truth grounded in choice, telling her that some paths required restraint, until the moment came to walk them openly, and that what mattered most was not the timing of revelation, but the trust between those who would share its weight. His words did not resolve her questions, but they steadied her, because they aligned with the integrity she had already seen, and she realized that whatever he carried was not something he used carelessly. The day of the council gathering arrived with a sense of anticipation that hummed through the pack lands, and as Elena and Adrian prepared to leave, she felt the gravity of the moment settle into her, not as fear, but as readiness, an awareness that the quiet phase of endurance was nearing its end. When they entered the council hall, the atmosphere shifted immediately, conversations lowering, attention sharpening, and Elena felt the same eyes that had once dismissed her now assess her with a caution that bordered on respect. Adrian stood beside her, composed, his presence anchoring the space around them, and as the council members began to speak, Elena understood that this was not simply a test of status, but of perception, of whether the story others had told themselves would hold under scrutiny. She met each gaze steadily, aware that whatever was coming would ask her to stand firmly in the choices she had made, and as the proceedings unfolded, she felt a quiet certainty take root, that the moment of mockery that had once defined her in their eyes was losing its power, replaced by something far less comfortable for them, the recognition that they might have misjudged not only her, but the man she had chosen to stand beside. The council gathering unfolded with a careful formality that masked an undercurrent of challenge, and Elena felt it in the measured questions directed her way, inquiries framed as concern for stability but weighted with implication, as though her marriage itself had become a variable needing assessment. She answered plainly, without defensiveness, describing her work, her intentions, her commitment to the pack, and with each response she sensed a subtle recalibration in the room, not acceptance, but reconsideration. When attention shifted to Adrian, the tone sharpened, council members probing his origins, his travels, his means, circling the same points with increasing precision, and Elena recognized the tactic, the attempt to expose weakness by repetition. Adrian responded with calm brevity, offering enough to satisfy courtesy without yielding ground, and the restraint in his voice carried a gravity that quieted interruptions before they fully formed. A senior alpha leaned forward then, his expression tight with impatience, questioning whether a man without recognized standing should influence pack affairs at all, and the room held its breath, waiting to see whether Elena would be compelled to defend or whether Adrian would finally react. Elena felt the familiar heat of judgment rise, but she did not step back. Instead, she placed her hand lightly against Adrian's arm, a steadying presence that spoke without words, reminding herself and the room that she was not an accessory to this moment, but a participant. Adrian met her glance briefly, something unspoken passing between them, and when he addressed the council again, his words were deliberate, focused not on himself, but on the principles they claimed to uphold: fairness, responsibility, and the value of measured leadership over loud authority. The shift was immediate, discomfort flickering across faces that had expected deference or defensiveness, not reflection, and Elena realized that the challenge had moved from personal scrutiny to ideological unease. As the discussion continued, a younger alpha questioned Elena directly, asking whether she regretted her choice now that she had seen the consequences, the isolation, the scrutiny, and the question cut deeper than the rest because it assumed shame as a given. Elena answered without hesitation, stating that she regretted nothing, that choosing integrity over convenience had clarified her place in the world, and that any cost paid in honesty was preferable to comfort built on silence. The room stilled, and in that quiet Elena sensed the turning of attention, not toward agreement, but toward acknowledgement, the recognition that she would not be bent by implication or softened by pressure. When the gathering finally adjourned, there was no verdict offered, no resolution declared, only an understanding that something unresolved now demanded consideration. Outside the hall, the air felt charged, eyes following Elena and Adrian with a mix of apprehension and curiosity that no longer bothered to hide itself. As they walked away together, Elena felt the weight of what had transpired settle into clarity. The council had not summoned them to diminish her marriage, but to measure its impact, and that realization carried both risk and possibility. Adrian spoke quietly as they moved beyond the crowded path, telling her that moments like this were thresholds, not conclusions, and that what unsettled others most was not revelation, but anticipation. Elena understood then that the escalation had reached its edge, that the careful restraint Adrian had maintained was not avoidance, but preparation, and as she looked ahead to the path unfolding before them, she felt a steady certainty take hold, that whatever truth waited beyond this tension would not erase her choice, but would instead illuminate it in a way no council chamber ever could. The shift came not with thunder or spectacle, but with a moment of unmistakable recognition that rippled through the space around them, beginning quietly and spreading until it could no longer be ignored. Elena felt it first as they crossed the outer edge of the council grounds, a subtle change in the air, a tightening of attention that made conversations falter and footsteps slow, and she turned just as a group of riders approached along the main path, their posture disciplined, their bearing formal in a way that did not belong to ordinary messengers. They dismounted with precision, eyes moving past the gathered onlookers until they found Adrian, and in that instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. Elena watched as each of them inclined their head, not casually, not politely, but with deliberate respect, and the silence that followed was so complete it felt like a boundary had been drawn. Adrian did not step forward or raise his voice, but when he acknowledged them, the change was undeniable, his presence sharpening, aligning, as though a veil had been set aside without ceremony. The riders addressed him with a title Elena had never heard spoken aloud in this territory, a title that carried weight even without explanation, and she felt the truth settle into her with a clarity that stole her breath, not as shock, but as understanding. Around them, murmurs broke free, quickly stifled by the gravity of what was unfolding, council members stiffening as realization spread, expressions shifting from scrutiny to calculation to something closer to awe. Adrian turned then, not to the council, but to Elena, his gaze steady and unguarded, and in that look she saw confirmation of everything she had sensed but never named. The reason restraint had felt like preparation, the reason calm had unsettled those who relied on hierarchy to feel secure. He spoke at last, his words measured, revealing not dominance, but truth. Acknowledging his identity as the Lycan King not as a declaration of power, but as a responsibility he carried regardless of whether others recognized it. The effect was immediate and profound. Council members rising instinctively, some bowing, others frozen by the recalibration demanded of them, and Elena stood at the center of it all, aware that every assumption made about her marriage, about her place, had just collapsed under the weight of reality. She did not move away from Adrian or step behind him, and that choice resonated as clearly as his revelation, because it reframed the moment not as one of rescue, but of partnership. When questions came, they were careful now, edged with respect rather than challenge, and Adrian answered only what was necessary, redirecting attention toward stability, cooperation, and the future rather than dwelling on the past. Through it all, Elena remained composed, absorbing the way eyes now turned to her with a mixture of astonishment and reassessment, realizing that her dignity, once overlooked, had been amplified rather than overshadowed by his truth. As the gathering dispersed, conversations resumed in hushed tones, and Elena felt the echo of mockery finally dissolve, replaced by a different kind of uncertainty, the kind that comes when a narrative must be rewritten. Adrian offered her his hand, not as a king claiming authority, but as a husband reaffirming choice, and as Elena accepted it, she understood with quiet certainty that the power revealed today did not redefine her worth. It simply illuminated what had been present all along, the strength to stand beside truth even when it wore the guise of humility, and to be seen, at last, for exactly who she had chosen to be. The aftermath of the revelation unfolded slowly, like the tide pulling back to expose a shoreline no one had realized was there, and Elena felt the change not as triumph, but as a profound recalibration of the world around her. The council members, once measured and distant, now approached with a careful gravity, their words chosen with intention as they addressed Adrian with deference that was unmistakable. Yet it was Elena who felt the true weight of the moment when their attention shifted to her, not as an extension of his authority, but as a figure whose presence demanded acknowledgement in her own right. Apologies were not spoken outright, but respect took their place, and Elena recognized the difference immediately, understanding that genuine recognition rarely arrived wrapped in regret, but instead in altered behavior. One by one, those who had questioned her choice began to reassess it openly, their voices quieter, their assumptions undone, and Elena stood composed through it all, neither basking in vindication nor retreating into humility, simply present, grounded in the dignity she had never relinquished. Adrian remained at her side, not directing the attention, but subtly redirecting it, emphasizing shared responsibility, stability, and cooperation, and Elena saw clearly then that the power he wielded was most evident in what he chose not to claim. As discussions resumed with renewed purpose, plans for strengthened alliances and shared resources were proposed, and Elena found herself included in conversations that had once excluded her entirely, her insights sought rather than dismissed, her experience valued rather than overlooked. She spoke thoughtfully, drawing from her understanding of the pack's needs, and each time she did, she felt the final remnants of mockery dissolve, replaced by a respect that did not require spectacle to sustain it. When the gathering concluded, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to cautious optimism, and as people dispersed, Elena noticed the way they looked at her now, not with curiosity alone, but with something closer to trust. Outside, under the open sky, Adrian paused, turning to her with an expression that held both pride and sincerity, and he acknowledged aloud what she had already known, that the strength she had shown had altered more than perception, it had altered possibility. Elena listened, absorbing his words without letting them define her, because she understood that recognition, though powerful, was not the source of her worth, merely its reflection. As they walked away from the council grounds together, Elena felt the past loosen its grip, the memory of laughter and dismissal fading into something distant and irrelevant, and she realized that the justice she had been granted was not loud or punitive, but balanced and enduring. That evening, as the village settled into a quieter rhythm, people approached their cabin not with demands or suspicion, but with offers of support, shared meals, and open conversation, and Elena accepted each gesture with the same grace she had shown in adversity. Standing beside Adrian as the stars emerged overhead, she felt a calm certainty settle within her, a knowledge that the life she had chosen had not only withstood scrutiny, but had reshaped the very standards by which she was judged, and in that realization, she found a sense of peace deeper than vindication, rooted not in revelation, but in the unwavering truth of who she had always been. Time moved forward with a steadiness that felt earned rather than granted, and Elena noticed how life around her and Adrian settled into a new rhythm, one shaped not by fear or spectacle, but by trust that had been tested and held. The cabin that had once been a symbol of quiet defiance became a place people visited openly, not out of obligation, but because they felt welcome there, and Elena found herself at the center of conversations about growth, cooperation, and the future, her voice no longer questioned before it was heard. Adrian continued to carry his responsibilities with measured restraint, refusing to rule through distance, choosing instead to be present, and Elena saw how that choice transformed the pack more effectively than any decree ever could. Together, they walked the land, listened to concerns, and offered solutions grounded in fairness. And Elena realized that the life she had chosen had expanded beyond personal fulfillment into something shared, something that touched others in quiet, lasting ways. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast warm light across the trees, Elena and Adrian stood just beyond the cabin, watching the village settle, and Elena felt a deep sense of continuity, a recognition that the path behind her and the one ahead were finally aligned. She thought back to the day of her wedding, to the laughter that had once felt sharp enough to define her, and she was struck by how distant it seemed now, not because it had been erased, but because it no longer held meaning. Adrian turned to her then, speaking not as a king or a leader, but as a partner, acknowledging that the choice she had made had required courage long before it ever offered certainty, and that her steadiness had shaped the outcome as much as any truth revealed. Elena accepted his words with quiet understanding, knowing that recognition mattered most when it honored who a person had been all along, not who they were allowed to become afterward. As night settled in, the stars emerging overhead, Elena felt a calm assurance take root, an understanding that justice, when it arrived honestly, did not seek to punish, but to restore balance, and that love, when chosen freely, did not require proof through hardship, only confirmation through time. She stood beside Adrian, aware that the world would continue to watch them, to measure and learn, but no longer feeling the weight of that attention as a burden. Instead, it felt like a responsibility she was ready to carry, grounded in the knowledge that she had remained true to herself even when the cost had been uncertain. In the quiet that followed, Elena reflected on how far she had come, not from weakness to strength, but from silence to voice, from expectation to choice, and she understood that the story others would tell about her marriage would always miss its most important truth. She had not been elevated by revelation, nor rescued by power, but recognized because she had never abandoned her dignity. As she and Adrian turned back toward the cabin, the path ahead illuminated by soft light, Elena felt a steady optimism settle in her chest, not because the future was guaranteed to be easy, but because it would be faced with integrity, partnership, and a strength that did not need to announce itself to be real.